Good evening, everyone. Before I begin talking about the show, I just want to take a quick moment to acknowledge Joe Tanner and Jimmy Carter, who both recently passed away and were instrumental in the deal to purchase Ossabaw Island from my family for the state to be its first heritage preserve. So just wanted to acknowledge their huge commitment to preserving Georgia and Ossabaw Island. Erin and I are so excited to introduce a project that has been in the works for more than 3 years and that we have been collaborating on intensively since last January. In the spring of 2026, Telfair Museums will open off the coast of Paradise, Ossabaw Island, Georgia, 1961 to now, the first major exhibition to examine the island's profound influence as a site for creative experimentation. Taking its name from a poem written on Ossabaw in 1981 by award-winning poet Henri Cole, Off the Coast of Paradise will feature a wide range of artists who have considered the island historically, environmentally, socially, culturally, or personally in their work over the last 60 years. In our lecture today, Erin and I will introduce the Ossabaw Island Project and Genesis, two landmark programs founded in 1961 and 1970 that brought artists to Ossabaw for the first time in a meaningful way. We will also discuss a selected group of artists whose time on Ossabaw profoundly affected their work and who will be featured in the exhibition. Following my great-grandmother's death in 1958, Ossabaw Island was passed down to my grandmother, Eleanor Torrey West, and her brother's 4 children, who were still minors at the time. The question of what to do with the undeveloped 26,000-acre barrier island weighed heavily on my grandmother's mind. Feeling guilty that she had the island all to herself, she wanted to open it to the public in some capacity. My grandfather, painter and educator Clifford B. West, warned her against opening up the island without any restrictions. He told her, quote, "If you do that, you'd be destroying the very thing that needs to be preserved that is so priceless." He suggested that they carefully consider how to welcome a limited number of visitors to fully experience the raw, remote, unvarnished wildness of Ossabaw. My grandparents ultimately landed on the idea of hosting a residency program on the island, likely inspired by my grandfather's many years studying and working in the interdisciplinary communities surrounding the Cranbrook Art Academy in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan, and his experiences at Birdcliff Artist Residency and the Maverick Colony in Woodstock, New York. The Wests felt that the highly specific environment of the island, with its endless stretches of unspoiled nature, wild animals, and no access to the outside world, was the perfect place to welcome creative people to retreat from their lives and concentrate on their work. They also felt that such a program would help to combat 2 fundamental issues that they perceived in contemporary culture. Quote, "One is the persistent and unaccountable acceptance of omnipresent man-made noise with the resultant difficulty in finding a place of natural quiet," my grandmother wrote in 1964. "The other is the urge of mass communication accompanied by an increasing problem in achieving communication between individuals." In other words, they believed that the residents would be able to work and communicate on Ossabaw in a way that they couldn't anywhere else. In order to achieve these goals, the Wests decided to differentiate their program from artist colonies such as Birdcliff, Maverick, Yaddo, McDowell, and others in one very specific way. They planned to invite intellectuals in the sciences, linguistics, history, mathematics, law, and other disciplines to Ossabaw, in addition to the painters, photographers, sculptors, writers, musicians, and other artists that the other programs focused on. To test their theory, they invited prominent people in their extended network to spend a weekend on Ossabaw in June 1961, including the sculptor Harry Bertoia, whom my grandfather knew from Cranbrook, the artist Arnold Blanche, who had introduced him to the colonies in Woodstock, the biologist Colin Pittendrigg, the author David Dodge, the composer Samuel Barber, as well as a lawyer, a banker, and a tax accountant, among others. Over on the right, this is the book that was given to each of the attendees of the conference. This was Tommy Markers, who was the first director of the Ossabaw Island Project. And for those of you who have been to the main house, you can see Lulu Bell's signature in the top right. My grandmother later remembered, quote, "We just let these people go. Clifford and I watched what was happening. Samuel Barber did not talk to the other musician who was there. He talked to Harry Bertoia, the sculptor. The writer, he talked to the banker from Savannah because he wanted to know the city's history. We found that they did not go and talk with the others in their field. In fact, they rather avoided them. At the breakfast table, for example, Harry Bertoia told about his theory of Etruscan sculpture, that he never would have gone into any other time because it was hypothetical. The weekend was a resounding success, proving that their idea had merit. In its wake, the Ossabaw Island Project, also known as OIP, was born, and my grandparents prepared to welcome their first residents that fall. The administration of the OIP was quite simple and informal. The group from 1961 formed the foundation of an advisory board, which was made up of distinguished men and women from various creative fields. Board members and later former residents proposed potential participants who were then invited to apply to come to Ossabaw for a period ranging from 1 week to 2 months. If accepted, residents were offered a private bedroom in my grandmother's family home on the island, 3 meals a day, and adequate working space depending on their discipline. Residents were given no social demands and were not expected to produce anything concrete during their stay. Samuel Barber felt strongly about this last point, saying, quote, "I know from a musician's point of view that maybe 3 years later they'll remember what the marsh grass sounded like." He was right. While my grandparents focused on the time and space that they could offer residents on Ossabaw, they didn't anticipate how powerfully the island itself would affect the residents. For instance, Harry Bertoia was left with a lasting sensation of the unvarnished expansiveness in the wake of his visit to South End Beach with the larger group in June 1961. The beach's dark, hard sand flats extend widely at low tide and then completely disappear when the water comes back in. This dramatic change is echoed by the ongoing erosion that plagues the island's southern tip. Quote, "I was deeply impressed by the constant battle of the elements," Bertoia said of the experience. "The sea was taking away part of the island, eroding these huge oaks. Some of them were falling, being denuded, scrubbed clean, and it was very impressive. I became aware of forces continuing." While the Italian-born Bertoia created a wide-ranging body of work that included prints and jewelry, he was a metalworker above all else. He is best known for his monumental public commissions, sound-making sculptures, and the side and diamond chairs he designed for Knoll in the early 1950s. Not long after his trip to Ossabaw, Bertoia visited Anaconda American Brass Company in Waterbury, Connecticut, to learn more about the possibilities of metal casting. While he was touring the facility, several massive cauldrons of ingot mistakenly overflowed. As Bertoia watched rapturously, the molten metal flowed onto the floor of the plant, creating pathways of its own. Quote, "I saw the movements. I became aware of the forces internally, the way things happen inside this globe. Great heat, movements," Bertoia remembered. "What we see on the surface is a volcano, eruptions. All that plus what I'd seen on Ossabaw Island came together, and I knew then what I should be looking for." Inspired by his experience at Ossabaw and in Waterbury, Bertoia developed an entirely new form of bronze casting that he dubbed spill casting for a major commission at the new Dulles International Airport in Washington, D.C. While other artists working in bronze at the time experimented with building on established methods such as lost wax and sand casting, Bertoia threw the rulebook out the window. Quote, "This takes us back to an aspect of casting so ancient that its origins are unknown," wrote the critic Lawrence Campbell in 1963. Bertoia pours his molten bronze in a shallow concave pit and then works on the surface of this metallic pond as it cools by scraping, cutting, punching. This dangerous process was accomplished with the help of rakes, water, and even stones that he would drop into the fray. Bertoia made several small-scale freestanding spill cast sculptures after the Dulles Commission. In 1966, he created one as a gift to the Ossabaw Island Project. In this piece, which will be featured in the exhibition at Telfair, and which you may have seen in the sunroom at Ossabaw, a large oblong stone juts out of the composition at the top right. The stone's smooth surface contrasts sharply with the highly textured bronze, upending perceptions of an already unlikely object. The addition of the stone builds on the radicality of the spill casting technique, positioning bronze, the hallowed medium of classic statuary from antiquity to the Italian Renaissance, as a material with the potential to be as malleable as sheet metal or even plastic. Following its arrival on the island, my grandfather wrote a long letter of thanks to Bertoia. Quote, "Before it is fixed in place, I want to transport it to the beach and place it here and there just long enough to get some photographs," he wrote. "I'm sure it will be most exciting to see it in relation to the original place which inspired thoughts about it." Unfortunately, we aren't certain if these photos were ever taken, but we remain on the hunt. Bertoia was one of the first OIP members to draw inspiration from the island, but many followed in his footsteps over the next 2 decades. The program grew steadily during that time, welcoming hundreds of residents across countless disciplines and from all over the world. The exhibition at Telfair will feature Ossabaw-related work by several of the artists who attended OIP during those years, including Agnes Dennis, Anne Truitt, Ellen Lanyon, Michael Mazier, Tex Shewitz, and Betty Tompkins. Before I turn you over to Erin, I would like to highlight one additional OIP artist who will figure prominently in the exhibition. The 39-year-old sculptor Tyrone Mitchell was a Savannah native living and working in New York City when he arrived at the Ossabaw Island Project in October 1980. Mitchell's primary interest in OIP was grounded in Ossabaw's significance to African American history in the United States. As he settled into the island, Mitchell began to feel the presence of those who had lived there before, and he started paying close attention to everything that happened around him. Quote, "On Ossabaw, even today, the slave quarters are still there, and people live in them," he later said. "The island seems to be inhabited by the spirits or ghosts of those former slaves, because when the emancipation came, these people didn't go to the mainland." Mitchell started collecting branches, vines, and other objects that he came across on Ossabaw and brought them back to New York City after his residency ended. He began contemplating how these natural formations might figure into his sculpture, working through ideas during a residency at the Studio Museum in Harlem from 1981 to 1982. The most striking of the Ossabaw works he created is Night Flyer, which will be included at the exhibition at Telfair. Suspended from the ceiling at 2 points, the work doesn't move beyond a minimal sway contingent on air currents in the room. At one end is an eye-shaped piece of ebony, which is attached to a nearly 3-foot-long branch that has been sanded down and varnished. Half of it is sheathed in aluminum, which exacerbates the object's resemblance to a shovel. This visual connection believes the natural form of the branch, which gracefully curves and bends in a way that could only be naturally occurring. Sourced from Ossabaw's maritime forest by Mitchell, the branch also functions to physically anchor the sculpture in the context of the island. An expanse of wire completes the composition, spiraling around the branch in 5 expansive loops. By incorporating objects taken from Ossabaw into his sculpture, Mitchell created a powerful site specificity that underscored the feelings, memories, and histories that he aimed to evoke. Mitchell paired these natural formations with austere industrial materials, such as aluminum, creating a tension between the unhampered environment of Ossabaw and the streamlined realities of modern society. The resulting effect is an indirect complexity that the curator Beryl J. Wright describes as, quote, the poetic incongruity of surrealist dreams. Mitchell isn't establishing a narrative in these works, but rather presenting contradictory energies in a composition imbued with the significance of its context. I will now turn you over to Erin Dunn, who will speak about Genesis, a second residency program that my grandparents imagined for Ossabaw in 1970.
The Genesis program, aptly described as an experiment of man and nature in harmonious coexistence, opened in the summer of 1970 in response to a need for students and younger people to have a space for research and study. Ossabaw's unique environment made it the perfect teaching island, an outdoor laboratory with a thriving ecological environment largely untouched by human intervention. Although still cross-disciplinary at its core, Genesis differed from OIP in several fundamental ways. Members resided at Middle Place, an area of the island located on Buckhead Creek that was previously utilized as a rice plantation site and later a lumber mill, and continued to offer an abundance of resources. They lived in abandoned rudimentary structures and built new housing with available materials like tabby and timber, noted here in the tree house seen in Nancy Marshall's 1979 photograph of fellow project member Deborah Shepard sitting on the rungs of the ladder. There was a well for fresh water, a food garden, and a cook shack. Participants had access to preserved meat, often wild boar, fresh eggs and chicken, and milk through the beloved cows Daisy and Jeannie. Structured initially as a program for college and graduate students in Georgia from multiple disciplines to earn school credit, the intention slowly broadened to allow participants outside of a formal degree-seeking program to experience a form of alternative living off the land. Although no age limit was formally imposed, the program attracted younger participants. The application process was uncomplicated and less dependent on a network. Applicants were still required to have a proposed project, but like OIP, no product was required. In the late 1970s, the program began to operate year-round, which helped add to that diversity of ages, skill sets, and backgrounds. Genesis members learned how to develop a community based around sustainable practices, and as one member noted, Genesis could be called a training ground for environmental awareness. While becoming sensitive to nature, each person learns from every other, sharing new discoveries, information gleaned from successes and failures of the projects, ideas born of silent starry nights or solitary strolls through the woods. Members contributed 5 hours a week to communal chores and 1 day a week to cook for the entire group. As has often been remembered by participants, because the workload was shared, there seemed to be a greater sense of community and camaraderie to ensure the success of the program. Despite its primitive nature, Genesis had a few tethers to the world beyond. Trucks were used if needed, and a weekly grocery run to Savannah provided requested food and supplies. Frequent cross-pollination occurred between Genesis and OIP members, as evidenced by one of the most memorable visual depictions of Ossabaw shown to a wider audience in the 1986 film Sherman's March, a meditation on the possibility of romantic love in the South during an era of nuclear weapons proliferation by Ross McElwee. McElwee attended OIP in 1980, eventually connecting with Genesis member Winifred or Winnie Wood, a PhD candidate in linguistics. When a space opened at Genesis, McElwee decamped from the main house to join Wood at Middle Place, capturing her in moments of labor and living, all while she presented advanced theories of linguistics. At one point in the film, as the camera scans across the landscape, a voiceover by McElwee states, "I'm convinced I've stumbled into Eden." The fruitful intermingling between disciplines remains one of the most distinct features of both residency programs on Ossabaw Island. There are several Genesis members who will be included in the exhibition, such as Helen Hamada, Leslie First, T.J. Reddy, John Earl, and more, but today I want to focus on the work of Vermont-based artist Marcy Hermansater. In 1982, the then 31-year-old artist attended Genesis for 6 weeks. In her application, she wrote of her interest in the spiritual and magical aspects of nature and her desire to live within the environment and create work showing the delicate balance of nature in contrast to our culture of waste and destruction. She had recently committed to working as an artist full-time, an aspiration since she had graduated from the Philadelphia College of Art in 1973. In preparation for her first visit to the South, she read Bartram's Travels, a late 18th century text of naturalist William Bartram's journey throughout the Southeast, and also looked into folk stories from the region. However, nothing prepared her for the amazing and surreal landscape she encountered. She had brought a portfolio of paper and colored pencils and soon discovered that some of her paper was unusable due to the high levels of humidity in the atmosphere. She stayed in the 2-room cabin previously occupied by sawmill workers, an industry made evident by the towering sawdust pile at Middle Place that residents would climb to radio to the main house. One of her drawings from the time on the island, the magic hoe, was drawn on light-colored paper that she imbued with the soil of Ossabaw. Featuring elements such as a shovel, axe, handsaw, bow saw, pitchfork, rake, and hoe, the work revealed her interest in the agricultural history of the island, and the title referenced an African-American folk story about agricultural prosperity using a magical hoe that produced an abundance of crops with minimal effort. Within the composition are figures and depictions of the tabby cabins that formerly housed the enslaved workers on the sites and continued to be used for Genesis members. The landscape weaves in and around the tools of industry and narratives of labor, and at the top, in the hanging Spanish moss, she collaged some mosquito netting that she found on the island and continues to use in her work even today. 1 year post-Genesis, Hermansater made another work titled Secrets of the Heart, as part of a series reflecting her not-so-secret longing to be back on Ossabaw. In the drawing, she evokes a sense of the mysteries of the natural world and an overflowing of aliveness, a sensation she felt there. The composition focuses on a heart-like form, a description often applied to the shape of the island itself, surrounded by an imagined landscape of twisting trees, dripping moss, and phosphorescent water. In a 1990 exhibition catalog, Hermansater recalled the impact of the island. Being on Ossabaw was for me like being at the center of all creation. It was a place where life was so abundant and varied, it was like a living textbook of ecological connections. Hermansater, like many others, has talked about her experience on Ossabaw as life-changing and how it remains a through line of her artistic practice. In addition to the long-standing impact of the programs on OIP and Genesis participants, the exhibition will also consider the legacy of both programs, featuring the works of artists who have spent time on the island since the residencies closed in 1982. These include Sally Mann, who featured Ossabaw in her 1996 series Motherland, Jack Lee, whose photographs of the island were included in Ossabaw Evocations of an Island, Betsy Kane, who helped facilitate the Ossabaw Island Foundation's Visiting Artist Program from 2002 to 2011, and Suzanne Jackson, who came to the island through that program in 2010. In the spirit of legacy, Kane's series of en plein air drawings made on Ossabaw will be shown tomorrow night at Laney Contemporary as part of a fundraiser to support the reinstatement of a residency program for artists of all disciplines to spend immersive time on the island, a monumental effort led by the Savannah-based nonprofit Arts Southeast. We are also very excited to share that as a foundational element of the upcoming exhibition, Telfair has commissioned the brilliant contemporary artist Allison Janae Hamilton to make the ambitious single-channel film Venus of Ossabaw, a commission generously supported by the Via Art Fund. Hamilton was born in Kentucky, grew up in Florida, and her maternal family's farm is in rural West Tennessee. Various regions within the American South form the cornerstone of her interdisciplinary practice, and her work centers the natural environment as a protagonist within historic and present-day stories. Blending concepts like folklore, familial history, hunting, and farming rituals, environmental justice, and feminist practice, Hamilton crafts haunting otherworldly mythologies that address concerns that include land loss, environmental degradation, and climate change. Venus of Ossabaw will follow an Ossabaw Island woman between southeast Georgia and northern Florida landscapes in the late 18th century, exploring the complex relationships between Black Americans and Southern land, as well as contemporary connections. Much of her interest in this narrative journey arose out of the research by Dr. Paul Presley, the subject of his most recent publication, The Southern Underground Railroad, and his lecture at Ossabaw Night last year. Hamilton's film will make a powerful statement about the continued significance of Ossabaw's landscape and culture through the necessary perspective of Black identity, building on the work of artists who have engaged with Ossabaw over the last 60 years. Given the rich local significance of Allison's film and the broader exhibition for the city of Savannah, we are thrilled that Venus of Ossabaw will be projected on the Jepson Center's facade each night during the first 3 months of the exhibition, in addition to being shown in the galleries. And I might be reaching out to Kaufman and Hines to help with the logistics of this down the road. Not only will this unusual mode of presentation make Venus of Ossabaw part of the fabric of Savannah's historic downtown, but it will allow audiences beyond the museum's visitors to experience the film. Ultimately, Ossabaw Island's known history and influence reverberate far beyond its physical shores. Off the Coast of Paradise and the accompanying publication, which will feature scholarly essays, remembrances, and archival materials, will offer one lens through which to explore the continuous and powerful pull of the island. We are so grateful to the Ossabaw Island Foundation for their continued support of this project and hope that you will plan to visit the exhibition at Telfair Museums when it opens next year. Thank you.
If you think a minute, there are no more listeners in the world. There's got to be a place for people who listen, because that's why you can't come to Ossabaw for one day. You've got to get into it, a peace and quiet. And if you walk down the main road, maybe you'll get an idea that could save the world.